All right, let's get going. In this series for Google Ads for mental health practices, building effective, profitable campaigns for your practice. We're going to actually do this together, but we're going to start off talking about conversions because that is the number one thing that we have to focus on in the beginning, making sure that we are measuring success and measuring it correctly. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is you need to know your numbers, right? So you need to know exactly how your campaigns are performing in terms of conversions, right? And conversions can mean a lot of different things. Conversions can be phone calls that last X amount of seconds. Conversions can be a form submission that comes through your website. If you're e-commerce, it can be, of course, sales. But it can be a lot of different things as well. If it's more like upper funnel conversions, perhaps it's a download of a lead magnet. But there are ways to structure these conversions the correct way. And it's super, super important that you do it right, because Google today is very different than Google of yesterday, and that Google really depends on these success signals, conversions, to be able to inform the algorithm. And what I mean by that is that you have certain bidding options now within Google. So you have smart bidding, right? So we're talking about maximize conversions, maximize conversion value, and then the associated target CPA and target ROAS. In order for Google to truly see that data accurately, it really needs accurate conversion information. So this means looking at your website, determining what actually represents value to your business and being able to capture that and report it back to Google. So without a doubt, before you do any campaign building, we got to make sure we're measuring conversion. So let's jump into, I'm going to take a look at a random example. This is not a client, this is just a website, but it is a mental health website. Let me just minimize this and let's talk just briefly about what we're looking at. So this is a new treatment center in Scottsdale, Arizona. Let's look at what these conversion actions could actually be, right? So we have this phone number up at the top. Here's a conversion. Like if somebody makes that phone call, now here's where it gets tricky. Now, is it a conversion if somebody makes a phone call and they decide to hang up 5 seconds later, right? So we have to look at certain things like phone calls and determine, okay, how long should that phone call last? There is phone tracking that's built into Google. So you can actually do this for free on one single number. If you have multiple numbers, then I would definitely recommend using one of the third-party services. And there's a handful that we work with on a regular basis. CallRail, call tracking metrics are two. And they're really, really valuable if you have multiple phone numbers that you're tracking and you're maybe doing marketing across many different channels. Let's pretend here that we just have a single phone number. We just need to track this particular number to see if this is a valid conversion. In this case, we would set up a conversion action within Google Ads that says, okay, if a phone call is made on this number, anytime an ad is clicked, we do a swap out. And it's basically pattern recognition. There's a little JavaScript code that runs on the website, and it takes this 480-270-00224 number and swaps it out for a Google tracking number that has the same area code. And it only happens after an ad click. So if somebody comes through organically and they don't click on an ad, then that does not happen at all. But it allows Google to be able to track it. If you wanted, the only thing that some companies don't like about that is that it actually swaps out the number for a Google number, and it goes into it's held in that pool for the advertiser for a certain amount of time. But that number at some point in the future could get reassigned to another advertiser. So if somebody writes that number down and then maybe they call 6 months later, it could go to a completely different company. But again, if that's a concern, then third-party services are definitely preferable. And again, it'd be like CallRail or call tracking metrics, right? So, but in this particular case, let's say that the single phone number tracking is fine. So we would just set it up for a lot of times 40 to 60 seconds if a call lasts that long, and then that's a valid conversion. Okay, so we have calls. Let's take a look here. In fact, let me just stay on the home page. So we have a contact us now button here. So this is another conversion action, right? And this is a form fill, and when a potential patient fills this form out and then they click on submit form, a lot of times that will go to a thank you page, If it goes to a thank you page, really easy to set up for conversion tracking. Some of these forms actually call themselves and they don't go anywhere, but they just stay on that same page. And there's ways to track that as well, but it depends on the form. But the form is definitely another way to track conversions. Here's a phone number again. Let's see if it's the same. So we have two different phone numbers, and this would be problematic for Google, right? With Google tracking, because Google can only track one phone number on a page. We are tracking 0024, which is this number, so it would swap out. The main campus number would not be tracked. So in this particular case, somebody could click on an ad, get to this page, and then call the main campus, and they'd have no idea that it was actually Google Ads that drove that lead. And here's another problem as well, email addresses. Okay, so this is, somebody could copy this, they click an ad, they can copy this, and then send off an email, and then it breaks the tracking, right? So we always recommend not doing this, actually sending somebody to a form. The form should be submitting into a CRM anyway, so you're controlling and being able to better manage your data as it comes in. In this particular case, it would just be an email, and it's really easy to get lost. Here's that phone number again, so it would swap out on this number. So anytime, again, you know, most of what we see in the mental health space is going to be lead gen, right? So we're talking about form submissions, phone calls. I don't think I've ever seen products for sale. If we were to pretend for a second, if there were products for sale, then of course those sales through the e-commerce shopping cart would also be conversions. Okay, so let's jump into an ad account. So I'm going to talk just briefly about how to set these up. I'm not going to go through the entire setup because there's a ton of videos out there that already address this, but we are going to go through it just through a couple steps because I want to talk about some things that are very important. And honestly, Google Ads changes a lot. So if I were to do something detailed today, it would probably change in 6 months. So let's jump in. But before we do that, let me talk about these particular conversion actions that we're seeing in the account. So we have a form submission here when we just looked at that on the website, right? We have calls from website, and I just talked about that. We have calls from ads, which is also important. So these are the ad extensions or ad assets. So if you think about it, if somebody's doing a search for, I don't know, in mental health, it might be TMS therapy. Okay, so maybe they do a search for TMS therapy. Especially on mobile, it will have a call extension, and they can easily just press it, and it's click to call. So that's another conversion that gets measured here. You know, some of the practices have schedulers, right? So third-party schedulers. This is actually one of the more challenging things because a lot of times the schedulers will take the user off into another domain and then send them back to your website. So that can get a little tricky as well, but those have to be captured 100%. But in this particular case, on this setup, the button click was configured to capture that event. I actually do not prefer that, and this is probably why the tag is inactive over here. You know, because somebody can click a button and not actually schedule. What needs to happen with schedulers is that when somebody goes over to the scheduler, a lot of times the scheduler software has the ability to actually hold your Google Analytics ID as well, so you can track it as a single session. And then when the scheduling is complete, you can then inform Google Ads that the conversion action has been completed. So that's preferable. But yeah, so it really depends on the details of how somebody's website is configured and which scheduler they're using. Okay. There are other conversions down here as well that are Google hosted, clicks to call. So these are not, we don't control any of these because they're part of Google. Clicks to call, for example, Smart Campaign map clicks, local actions, these would be directions, right? Smart Campaign map directions, Google hosted. These are all Google hosted here. Some of them are questionable, quite honestly, because Smart Campaigns have a whole bunch of these Google hosted conversion actions. And you look at it, it's like, wow, that's really doing well. But if you dig into the details, it might just be, you know, local actions or something like that instead of a form fill or an actual phone call. But let's jump into creating a conversion action. We're just going to play pretend here. And the first thing you get is like, well, what kind of conversions do you want to track? Do you want to track website conversions, app, phone calls, or import your conversions, which would be an import from like Salesforce or something like that. In this case, we're just going to pretend that this is a website form fill. And let's click on there. So we're going to put in It will ask us for a website address. So we'll do that now. And it's going to scan to see if conversion actions have already been set up. In this case, what we normally do is just say add a conversion manually anyway. So this is where we actually add the conversion. It's going to ask us the goal, action optimization. So, what is the sales category, for example? Is this a purchase? Is it an add to cart, begin checkout? So these would be more of your e-commerce type categories. If you scroll down here, you'll see lead categories such as contact, submit lead form, book appointment, right? So book appointment could be very applicable to mental health practices, or sign up for something, or request a quote. So it's important to make sure you categorize it correctly from an organizational standpoint, and then give it a conversion name. In fact, let's just go through that. I'm going to say book an appointment, and we'll just keep it like this. I'm going to delete this out anyway. Down here, it's use the same value for each conversion. So it's about, well, what is a prospect worth? And that's something that you would have to determine internally. What is your close rate? What is the average patient value over time? And we actually talk about that in another video. So figure out what the value is for each conversion. I'm just going to say maybe $100, okay? Is it the same value for each conversion? Is it a different value for each conversion? Usually it's the same for lead gen, different, of course, for like e-commerce, right? Does it happen every single time, or does it just happen one time? Now think about lead gen versus e-commerce. E-commerce, it would be every time because you could do multiple sales throughout the day. With lead gen, most likely just one time. So we typically default that to one. Conversion window, click through conversion window. So this is your attribution window. So how long after a click, the initial click, should we recognize that over time? Let's say that they don't make an actual form submission right away. They're in the consideration stage, they're contemplating, they have clicked an ad, they've gone to your website, and they're still exploring, and they're looking at other competitors of yours, and they come back on day 29, right? And so does that get counted? So this is where we say, yeah, because we're in the 30-day window. Or do we say 90-day window, right? Can we capture them 3 months later as well? So that's a thing. Another thing you'd have to figure out internally, like how long is that actual buy cycle? And that determines the length of your conversion window. All right, so engaged view conversion window. So there's a bunch of them. Typically we just leave this. This is a video engagement. This is view through conversions. So after somebody views your ad, right? So this is a little trickier as well, because did they really see it? It's one of those things. But this is the most important up here, the click, because we're very much click driven. We just typically just default this to 3, and then this one's defaulted to 1. Data driven, you have a bunch of attribution models, and this definitely not for this video because we could spend an hour on this. Back in the day, a lot of it was defaulted to last click, but now it's recommended data driven. We highly recommend you just keep it as data driven because Google is now pretty much optimized around that. All right. This is a little tricky add-on that Google has done recently. Sneaky Google at the bottom here going, enable enhanced CPC. So, if and it's pre-checked, which is kind of crazy, but you got to make sure that actually this is unchecked unless you truly want to enable enhanced CPC. This allows Google to be able to spend way more than what you've said in terms of your bids. So you should actually do that on a campaign by campaign basis and not allow Google just to apply that account wide. So always uncheck that. Let's make sure we have everything. Yes. I'm going to say book appointment, test, because we're going to delete this out. Okay. Save and continue. Okay, so this is where you would actually implement your conversion action. Now, here's set up with a Google tag, email instructor to your webmaster. or instructions rather to your webmaster, or use Google Tag Manager. This is the preferred method that we use pretty much all the time. Google Tag Manager, if it's not running on your website, should be running on your website. It's free, by the way, and it allows Google to make a single call to the cloud for pretty much all your tags. We run all of the tags pretty much through Google Tag Manager. Not only the Google tags, but Facebook tags, for example, the Facebook Pixel. And again, it's just easier to be able to manage any piece of code that's running on your website without having to interface through somebody in IT, right, who might be busy and maybe 2 weeks later they get to it. If we're running Google Tag Manager, when you place Google Tag Manager on your website, there's 2 little pieces of code that get added to the header section, which just repeats itself over and over again, any single page. And it's really simple to set up. It literally takes 5 minutes typically. Once it's set up, then you have full access to be able to add whatever you need from a marketing perspective to your website without having to bring somebody else in, right? So highly recommend that you use Google Tag Manager for a lot of different reasons. So in this particular case, we would use Google Tag Manager. We would then set up the tag in GTM, Google Tag Manager, using this conversion ID. And then this conversion label down here as well. And again, that's for another video. That could be another 30-minute video. So this is part of what we do, by the way, is our service. So if it's at any point something that's like you don't want to deal with this, then just let us know, because this is what we specialize in. Okay, so this is part of your build that we would do for you. But if you're more hands-on, you want to do it yourself, please look into it. Make sure you got GTM running, and then just set up your conversion tracking this way. Within the GTM, you would specify when this conversion action fires. And this is where it gets a little tricky too, because remember we talked about in this particular example on this form, the conversion action would fire when they submit the form, right? It could be on a thank you page, or if it calls itself, it could be on an ID. It could be on a lot of different things. It depends on the form software as to how that would be tracked. But again, Google Tag Manager makes it a lot easier to be able to track that. So highly, highly recommended. I think I've said it 5 times though. All right, so what am I think I've got everything there. Yeah, so we went through, again, just to quickly recap, what are conversions, right? What needs to be tracked? That'd be phone calls, form submissions, anything that represents value. If you got multiple phone numbers, you're probably going to want to use a third-party service like CallRail or Call Tracking Metrics. And then once you're in the account, there are ways to be able to set this up the proper way. Okay, so let's look at what we just. So here's the book appointment test. You can see that it defaulted to primary. Okay, so this is another important thing. Account or action optimization. Primary conversion actions are used for optimizing your bid strategy when the corresponding conversion goal is selected for a campaign. They're also reported in the conversions column. So this is important. Conversions is what we look at in the conversion column. Secondary conversion actions are used solely for observational purposes. So primary conversions are used to inform the Google algorithm and really train Google as to what represents value for your business. Okay, so it's important that only those conversions that represent value, phone calls, for example, form submissions, are set as primary. You shouldn't have, for example, page views in most cases as a primary conversion, because you'd be misinforming the algorithm, right? The algorithm would be like, oh, anybody who goes to the booking page, even though they haven't booked, is a primary conversion. Now, that could be maybe valid in some small cases, but most of the time you don't want that. You want real conversions. Otherwise, Google will start optimizing for something that is meaningless, right? So, and it just ends up wasting money. So, make sure you're actually categorizing primary as a true primary conversion, and anything else that is maybe not exactly tied to an actual potential patient. Maybe maybe they're further down. Maybe they're exploring and they've downloaded something from your website, but they're not ready to make a decision. That would be more of a secondary conversion. Okay, so you can actually go in after and edit settings. and you will see there it is, right? So you can then set it, let's say that it's a download instead of booking an appointment. That wouldn't make sense here because we already said book appointment. But if it was another type of conversion, you would just change it here. So you just change it to secondary and then save, and you'd be done, okay? So I hope you found value in this. I know it's a long 20-minute video, but this is so important. It's really, really important to get this right. If you don't get it right, you're going to be misinforming Google. And in some cases, you have to reset the learnings because it totally screws up the way that they're targeting through the smart bidding. So make sure you get this right. It is the number one thing that you have to do before you even start building any campaign. All right, thank you. And we will be back with the next video, which I believe is knowing your goals. Also very important. See you soon.